The morning the trouble began, I woke up earlier than usual, not because of the sun spilling through the blinds or the birds calling along the tree line, but because of the anticipation that had been building in me for weeks. I had spent long hours repairing the old family boat, sanding its hull, tuning its engine, polishing its sides until it gleamed like it did back when my father first taught me to steer it across the lake. That boat wasn't just a vessel, it was memory and legacy stitched into wood and steel, carrying with it the laughter of summers past, the sweat of hard work, and the comfort of belonging on water that my family had owned for generations. I remember pausing on the porch that morning, inhaling the sharp crisp air, and feeling that little tug in my chest, the same one I always felt when I looked at the water. It was my lake, clear and shimmering, framed by pines that had stood longer than the homes now crowding its banks. And on that day, after too many delays, I was finally going to launch my boat back where it belonged. The boat launch was part of my land, carved into the shoreline by my grandfather himself, a simple but sturdy slip that had weathered decades of storms. It had been quiet for a long time, and used while I worked away in the city, but now that I was back, it was mine to use again. I walked down to the water with my coffee, saw the mist curling off the lake's surface, and felt a calmness settle into me. That calmness lasted right up until I heard the voices. At first they were faint, carried across the water like distant echoes, but soon enough, they grew louder, sharp, clipped, demanding. It didn't take long before I saw them, 3 members of the HOA board, standing stiff on the path above my dock, dressed like they were headed to a boardroom instead of standing on lakeside soil. Their leader, a man named Gerald, had that smug expression I had seen too many times before, the look of someone who believed rules mattered more than rights, appearances more than truth. I didn't engage right away. I continued untying the boat, checking the straps, moving deliberately, because I wasn't about to let them steal the peace I had carried with me into that morning. But they couldn't resist the urge to intrude. "You can't launch here," Gerald barked, voice brittle like snapping twigs. "This is HOA property. All water access goes through the marina, and launching fees are mandatory." His words hung in the air like a bad smell, his tone leaving no room for dialogue. I turned to face him slowly, coffee still in hand, and let my eyes sweep past him to the other 2, one clutching a clipboard like it was a sword, the other with her arms crossed so tightly across her chest I wondered how she breathed. They looked at me as though I were trespassing, as though the land beneath my boots hadn't belonged to my bloodline before any of their vinyl-sided houses had even been conceived. I told them, calmly, that the dock was mine. That the slip was mine. That the lake itself, yes, the whole body of water, was mine, deeded, registered, taxed, and recorded. I could have shown them the paperwork, but I didn't. Because they already knew. They just didn't care. They thrived on rules written in binders and printed on newsletters, the kind that gave them a taste of power over neighbors too weary to fight back. That may have been the case once, Gerald sneered, but this community has standards now. We maintain the marina, and all boats must launch there. That's the rule. If you don't comply, there will be consequences. His words dripped with practiced authority, like he had said them to a dozen other homeowners before me. The clipboard woman nodded vigorously, scribbling notes, as though documenting my defiance was some sort of crime. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. The idea that anyone could tell me I couldn't launch my own boat, on my own shoreline, into my own lake, it was beyond arrogance. It was madness. But they didn't laugh back. Gerald's face darkened, his jaw clenching, and he spat the words that set everything in motion. "If you launch that boat, I'll call the cops." The words should have shaken me. Maybe that was his intention, to scare me into backing down, to remind me that authority has teeth. But instead, they did something else entirely. They sparked that stubborn fire deep inside me, the one I had inherited from my father and his father before him, the one that had carried our family through lean years and hard fights. I looked Gerald dead in the eye and told him, "Call them." Then I finished my coffee, set the mug down on the dock, and fired up the engine. The sound of that engine cracking to life was like thunder rolling across the valley. The boat shuddered, groaned, and then roared, the smell of fuel and water mixing into the air, announcing its return like a war drum. I eased it forward, the hull kissing the water, ripples spreading wide. Gerald's face twisted, red with rage, and true to his word, he pulled out his phone. His fingers jabbed the screen as though stabbing me through it. The clipboard woman gasped dramatically, already envisioning some imagined law breaking. The other board member muttered something about community order. But I didn't stop. I guided the boat fully into the water, felt the lake embrace it again, and for a moment, all the noise behind me faded. For the first time in years, I was back where I belonged, skimming across the surface, the wind tearing past me, the world falling away. Of course, the cops did come. 10 minutes later, as I pulled the boat back toward the dock to check the engine's responsiveness, I heard sirens in the distance, faint but growing. It was almost laughable, the idea of police racing down a lakeside road to stop a man from launching a boat on his own property. But that's what the HOA wanted, and that's what they got. 2 cruisers pulled up near the Marina entrance, lights flashing, officers stepping out with uncertainty written all over their faces. They weren't sure what kind of call this was: trespassing, disturbance, theft. Gerald was already marching toward them, waving his arms, his voice carrying across the water as he spun his tale of defiance, disorder, and disrespect. I docked calmly, tied the boat, and walked up the path toward them, not hurried, not afraid, just steady. The officers turned toward me, hands resting on their belts, but not aggressive. They had that look of men dragged into something petty, already tired of it before it began. I handed them my deed, crisp copies I always kept in a folder for moments exactly like this. They read. They blinked. They looked at each other. Then they looked at Gerald, whose confident posture was already faltering. "Sir," one officer said carefully, "this paperwork shows he owns the lake, including this dock and slip." The silence that followed was delicious. Gerald stammered, tried to argue about rules and bylaws, but the officer cut him off. HOA rules don't override property deeds. He's within his rights. The board members froze. Their power, their authority, their threats, they all evaporated in that instant, exposed under the simple light of truth. Gerald's phone dangled at his side, the call wasted, the fight lost before it began. I didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't taunt. I simply looked at him, let the moment hang, and then turned back to my boat. Because nothing said victory like silence. But deep down, in that quiet, I knew something else had begun. The HOA had tried to flex its control, and I had shown them their limits. And people like Gerald don't take kindly to limits. What I didn't know then was how far they would push next, or how, in less than a month, their greed and arrogance would deliver me the sweetest victory of all, ownership of their precious Marina. The fallout from that morning didn't come all at once, it trickled in like a slow leak, building pressure until the whole thing threatened to burst. For a few days after the cops drove away and the HOA board scattered, I almost thought it might end there. I thought maybe Gerald and his clipboard cronies would lick their wounds, mutter to each other about my defiance, and then move on to harassing someone else about lawn height or mailbox colors. But men like Gerald don't retreat. They regroup. They plot. And soon enough, I could feel the shift in the air every time I walked down to the dock. Their stares carried more venom, their newsletters dripped with passive-aggressive reminders about community order, and little whispers traveled from porch to porch. "Did you hear about that man who thinks he owns the whole lake?" At first, I ignored it. I busied myself with the boat, taking it out daily, letting the engine stretch its legs, rediscovering hidden coves and shaded fishing spots my father had once shown me. Every time the bow cut through the water, I felt freer, as if I were pushing back against years of accumulated nonsense. But each trip out seemed to stir more resentment on shore. People would stop and watch, hands shielding their eyes, their faces a mixture of envy and irritation. Kids waved, their parents pulled them back. A few bold ones shouted across the water about marina fees or safety inspections. I never shouted back. I didn't need to. The deed was my shield, the lake my proof. Then the letters started. Not from the county, not from the state, those offices had already confirmed my rights, but from the HOA itself. Thick envelopes stuffed into my mailbox, printed with their official header, stamped with warnings in bold red ink, violation notice. They accused me of unauthorized use of community resources, non-compliance with HOA guidelines, and even endangering community harmony. Each letter came with a fine, escalating with every so-called offense. Launch fee, $250. Unauthorized docking, $500. Disorderly conduct, $1,000. The absurdity was almost impressive. They thought if they buried me under paper, I'd fold. They thought if they pretended hard enough, their rules could overwrite my deed. I didn't pay a dime. Instead, I stacked the letters neatly on my desk, filing them like trophies of their desperation. When Gerald himself showed up at my gate one afternoon, demanding payment, I handed him copies of the county assessor's maps and title history, each one proving the truth. He didn't take them. He didn't even look. He just shook his head, muttered something about setting a bad precedent, and left. That was when I realized this wasn't about boats, or launches, or even money. It was about control. The HOA board had built its power on the illusion that their word was law. And I had shattered that illusion in front of cops, neighbors, and anyone else within earshot. They weren't just angry, they were humiliated. And humiliation breeds obsession. The obsession showed itself in small acts at first. My mailbox was knocked down twice in a week. Someone spray-painted "Rule Breaker" across the road in front of my drive. A dead fish was left on my porch, it stench a crude warning. I didn't flinch. I fixed the mailbox, scrubbed the road, buried the fish, and kept launching my boat. Every act of defiance, every quiet refusal to bend, seemed to pour gasoline on their fire. I knew they were building towards something bigger, some plan meant to break me. And I was right. It happened on a Saturday morning. I had taken the boat out early, enjoying the glassy surface of the water before the sun fully broke over the ridge. When I returned to the dock, I saw a crowd gathering at the marina across the lake. Dozens of residents clustered together, HOA board members at the front, a bullhorn in Gerald's hand. I could hear his voice carrying across the water, loud and self-righteous, "This lake is a community resource. We will not allow individuals to disrupt its harmony. This is our water, our marina, our right." The crowd cheered, fists raised, voices chanting. It was less a meeting and more a rally, a show of force meant to scare me. But I knew something they didn't: noise doesn't change the law. Still, I watched. Gerald paraded up and down the dock like a general, pointing toward my property, whipping the crowd into a frenzy. He announced new HOA mandates, declaring all water access restricted to the marina. He bragged about their upcoming lawsuit, claiming they would seize improperly used land through eminent domain. His words were bold, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked toward me again and again, searching for a reaction. I gave him none. I just leaned on my railing, arms crossed, watching like a man observing a circus from the safety of the stands. But what he didn't know was that I had already been planning. You see, while they were busy writing fines and holding rallies, I had been digging into their finances. Public records, liens, county filings, they're all there if you know where to look. And what I found was sweeter than any revenge I could have imagined: the HOA didn't own the marina. They leased it. The land under it, the very planks they strutted across, belonged to an old developer who had grown tired of their constant demands and late payments. The HOA was 3 months behind on their lease, 1 month away from default. And when they defaulted, the marina would go up for sale. I kept that knowledge close, tucked away like a loaded pistol. I let Gerald scream into his bullhorn, let the crowd jeer and chant, let the letters pile higher on my desk. Because I knew the day was coming when their empire would crumble under its own arrogance. And when it did, I would be there, deed in hand, ready to claim not just my right to the lake, but the very symbol of their authority, the marina itself. That night, as I sat on my porch with the crickets humming and the stars reflecting on the water, I thought about my father. I remembered him telling me, long ago, that real power isn't about yelling the loudest, it's about waiting for the right moment and striking with precision. Let them overreach, he had said. Greed always digs its own grave. And as I sipped my drink, listening to the faint echo of Gerald's rally still buzzing across the lake, I realized the grave had already been dug. They just hadn't fallen in yet. The lawsuit came just as I expected. A thick envelope arrived by certified mail, stamped with the HOA's seal like it carried the weight of a crown. Inside was a stack of papers an inch thick, filled with legal jargon, accusations, and demands. They claimed I had violated community trust, interfered with shared resources, and caused emotional distress by daring to launch my boat from my own shoreline. They wanted fines, damages, and, most laughably, an injunction preventing me from accessing their lake. Reading it was like staring at a parody of justice, a desperate attempt to turn fantasy into law. I wasn't shaken. I'd been through legal battles before in my business days, and I knew that lawsuits often look scarier than they are. The truth was simple, the deed was mine, the taxes were paid, the ownership recorded. No amount of bluster could erase that. Still, I didn't take it lightly. I hired an attorney, an old friend of my father's, a man with more courtroom scars than Gerald could ever dream of inflicting. He read the complaint, chuckled, and said, "They're playing checkers, son. We're playing chess." That was all I needed to hear. Court dates were set. Filings were made. The HOA strutted into the courthouse in pressed suits and self-righteous glares, Gerald at the front like a rooster leading hens. They spoke in solemn tones about community integrity, waving binders filled with rules and bylaws, as though paper and ink could outweigh the county's records. When it was our turn, my attorney stood calmly, handed the judge the title history, the tax receipts, and the deed itself, all notarized and unbroken for nearly a century. The judge barely needed 5 minutes before shaking his head. "Case dismissed," he declared. "Property ownership is clear. HOA covenants do not supersede deeds." The look on Gerald's face was priceless, flushed red, his jaw slack, his carefully prepared speech crumbling into dust. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other like children caught lying. Outside the courtroom, I walked past them without a word, my silence cutting deeper than any gloat could. They had wanted a public victory, a chance to shame me. Instead, they got a public defeat, and worse still, they had wasted thousands of dollars of their members' dues to chase a fight they never had a chance of winning. That loss should have ended it, but humiliation is a dangerous fuel. Instead of backing down, the HOA doubled down. Newsletters turned venomous, painting me as a villain who stole the lake from the community. Neighbors were pressured to shun me, to whisper about my arrogance, to glare as I drove by. Gerald even organized patrols, volunteers in reflective vests walking the shoreline, taking photos of my property like amateur detectives. They couldn't touch me legally, so they tried to bury me socially. But here's the thing, when people are pushed too far, they start to see the cracks in their so-called leaders. Homeowners began asking questions. Why were their dues going up while their lawsuit had collapsed? Why were funds being drained for rallies, flyers, and petty patrols instead of road repairs and landscaping? Why was the marina, their pride and joy, falling into disrepair while Gerald obsessed over one man and his boat? The whispers that had once targeted me began to shift direction. Neighbors who once sneered now stopped me quietly at the gas station, muttering, "Keep fighting. We're with you." Cracks were spreading, and I could feel the foundation of their power weakening. Meanwhile, I kept one eye on the calendar, counting down the days until the HOA's marina lease defaulted. Every evening, I checked county records online, watching as the overdue payments stacked up like dominoes. Gerald must have thought he could bluff his way out, that the landlord would cut him slack, that the board's posturing could delay the inevitable. But paper doesn't care about pride, and debt doesn't forgive arrogance. The day finally came. A notice appeared in the county's filings, lease terminated. Marina property to be auctioned. My heart thudded when I read it. After all their bluster, after all their threats, after all their rallies and lawsuits, the HOA's crown jewel was slipping through their fingers. I didn't tell a soul. I simply prepared. I called my lawyer, arranged financing, and made sure every document was airtight. The auction was held in a bland county office, fluorescent lights buzzing, a handful of bidders scattered across the room. Gerald and 2 board members sat in the front row, faces pale, papers clutched in sweaty hands. They had scraped together what they could, but it wasn't enough. When the bidding began, their voices cracked, straining to push the numbers higher, desperate to hold on. But I was calm. Each time they bid, I raised them without hesitation. Their shoulders slumped lower and lower, their whispers turning frantic. And then, at last, their silence fell. The gavel came down, and with it, ownership of the marina passed into my hands. I didn't look at Gerald. I didn't need to. The sound of the gavel had said everything. In less than 10 minutes, I had taken from them the very thing they had tried to use against me. Their symbol of power, their hub of control, their so-called community resource, it was mine now. Mine to use, mine to control, mine to remind them every time they looked across the lake that arrogance always comes with a price. That night, I stood on the marina dock alone, the water lapping gently at the pilings, the stars reflecting above. I could almost hear my father's laughter in the wind, his voice saying, "Patience, son. Let them dig their own graves." And I knew then that the fight wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about proving that no amount of false authority can strip away what's rightfully yours. The HOA had tried to bury me. Instead, they had buried themselves. And I was the one left standing, holding the deed to their dreams. The morning after I bought the marina, the neighborhood felt different, like the air itself had shifted. It wasn't just me who knew, word spread faster than wildfire. Some said they saw Gerald storm out of the auction red-faced, others claimed his wife was in tears in the parking lot, but by sunrise, everyone knew the truth, the HOA no longer owned the marina. I did. For years, they had used that dock as a stage to flaunt their power, their little kingdom of rules and ribbons, their petty inspections and fishing permits. Now, it all belonged to the man they had tried to destroy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I didn't make a grand announcement. I didn't rub it in their faces, not yet. Instead, I let silence do the work. I posted a small sign at the marina's gate, "Private property, access by owner's permission only." Just 7 words, but they hit harder than any speech. Neighbors who once strolled down the dock now stopped at the gate, reading the sign, glancing back at their friends with uncertainty. Some turned around quietly, some muttered curses under their breath, and a few even chuckled, shaking their heads as if to say, "Well, they asked for it." That sign did more damage to the HOA's image than any rant I could have given. Gerald, of course, lost his mind. He called an emergency meeting, plastering flyers on mailboxes, summoning the neighborhood to the clubhouse. I didn't attend, but I heard plenty afterward. He pounded his fist on the podium, declaring that the HOA would not bow to one man's greed. He claimed they were exploring legal options, fundraising efforts, even community activism. But by then, people weren't buying it. They asked simple questions: where had their dues gone? Why hadn't the board paid the marina lease? How had Gerald let it slip away in the first place? And most damning of all, what made him think he could fight a deed when he couldn't even balance a budget? Neighbors who had once parroted his speeches were now whispering against him. Some stood up and walked out mid-meeting, shaking their heads. By the time it ended, half the chairs were empty, and Gerald's voice was cracking under the weight of his own failed authority. I didn't need to lift a finger. His empire was crumbling, and the cracks were spreading faster than he could patch them. Meanwhile, I made quiet improvements to the marina. I fixed broken boards on the dock, repainted the posts, and cleared out years of neglected equipment. I hired a small crew to dredge the shallow section, making the water cleaner, deeper, safer. The sight of actual progress, paid not by HOA dues but by my own pocket, didn't go unnoticed. Families started approaching me timidly, asking if they could fish again, if their kids could swim off the dock like old times. I didn't turn them away. I let them use it, but on my terms. No HOA patrols, no fines, no absurd rules about approved fishing lines. Just respect and gratitude. And in return, I earned something Gerald had never managed, trust. It infuriated him. He tried spinning the narrative, claiming I was exploiting the community for my own gain. But every time he spoke, his words rang hollow. People had eyes. They saw who kept the lake clean, who fixed the dock, who opened the gates with a smile instead of a sneer. Gerald's rules had bred resentment. My quiet generosity built loyalty. Then came the financial storm. With the Marina gone, the HOA's revenue shrank dramatically. Membership fees alone couldn't cover their bloated expenses, their patrols, their lawsuits, their endless propaganda campaigns. Dues skyrocketed. Bills piled up. Residents started refusing to pay, citing mismanagement and corruption. Foreclosures threatened. Gerald scrambled, sending letters, knocking on doors, threatening liens. But people were no longer afraid. They saw him as a desperate man clinging to power, not a leader guiding a community. Some of the board members jumped ship. They resigned quietly, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth, they didn't want to sink with Gerald. Meetings became sparsely attended, minutes left unsigned, votes half-hearted. The HOA, once a fearsome machine of fines and threats, was now a sputtering engine running on fumes. And all the while, I kept building, repairing the marina, hosting small gatherings, even organizing a lakeside cookout where families came together for the first time without HOA oversight. Laughter filled the air, kids splashed in the water, and the night ended with fireworks reflecting off the lake. People hugged me, shook my hand, and whispered, "You gave us our lake back." But Gerald wasn't finished. Pride like his doesn't go quietly. One night, I caught him and two of his loyalists sneaking around the marina with flashlights, trying to post signs claiming unauthorized use, report to HOA. I stepped out from the shadows, my own light cutting across them. "That's trespassing," I said evenly. The look on his face was something I'll never forget, rage, humiliation, and fear all tangled together. He sputtered about bylaws and community rights, but his voice shook. "Not your property anymore," I told him, holding up a copy of the deed. "And the sheriff agrees." They left without another word, their signs still clutched in trembling hands. From that night on, the balance shifted completely. Gerald became a ghost in his own kingdom. He stopped showing up to meetings, stopped patrolling, stopped sending letters. Rumors spread. Some said he drained the HOA account trying to pay off legal fees, others whispered his own home might go up for sale. I didn't bother confirming. His silence was victory enough. And so the neighborhood changed. Without the HOA's grip, people started taking pride in their homes for themselves, not because of threats or fines. Gardens bloomed, kids played freely, and the lake became a place of joy instead of judgment. The marina, once a symbol of control, became a symbol of freedom. And every time I stood on that dock, watching the sunset ripple across the water, I knew I had done more than win a fight. I had restored balance. But deep down, I also knew something else. Gerald wasn't gone for good. Men like him don't just vanish. They stew. They plot. They wait for a chance to claw back what they've lost. And as peaceful as those summer evenings on the lake felt, I could sense the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The HOA might have collapsed, but Gerald's pride was still alive, and I knew he wouldn't rest until he tried one last time to take back what he believed was his. For a while, I allowed myself to believe the storm had passed. The lake was quiet, the community was thriving without HOA shackles, and Gerald had vanished from the spotlight. But men like Gerald don't just fade into the background, they smolder. And smoldering fires, if left unchecked, often flare into something far more destructive. It started small, anonymous letters slipped into mailboxes. They accused me of exploiting the community, of stealing the Marina, of secretly planning to sell the property to developers. The tone was desperate, not convincing. Most neighbors laughed it off. But I knew Gerald's handwriting, his rhythm, his bitterness. He was stirring the pot again, testing the waters. I ignored it at first, but then the vandalism began. One morning, I found the Marina gate padlock cut clean through, the sign torn down and tossed in the dirt. Another day, someone spray-painted "community property" across the dock. At night, I sometimes caught glimpses of flashlights in the distance, shadows moving along the shoreline. I never confronted them directly. I wanted evidence. So I installed cameras, hidden, discreet, covering every angle. Within a week, the truth was in my hands, Gerald and two of his most loyal followers sneaking around, cutting chains, posting phony HOA rules, signs like ghosts clinging to a dead kingdom. I took the footage straight to the sheriff. The man sighed, rubbing his temples. "We've had enough calls about him to last a lifetime," he muttered. "But this time, you've got him dead to rights. Trespassing. Vandalism. Harassment." They weren't big charges on their own, but combined, they painted a picture of obsession gone too far. A warrant was issued, and the very next weekend, Gerald was led out of his house in handcuffs while half the neighborhood watched. The once feared president of the HOA was now just a disgraced man, his wrists bound, shouting half-hearted threats no one believed. You'd think that would have been the end. But Gerald wasn't just fighting me, he was fighting reality, fighting the collapse of the empire he'd built brick by brick on fear and manipulation. And desperate men sometimes go to desperate lengths. Out on bail, awaiting his court date, he made one final move. It was late one Saturday night when I heard the low rumble of an engine outside my house. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor's truck, but then I noticed the direction, it was coming from the Marina Road. I stepped onto my porch, the night air cool against my skin, and saw headlights bouncing across the dirt path toward the lake. My gut told me something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight, my phone, and hurried down. What I found froze me in my tracks. Gerald had backed a rental truck up to the marina. The back was open, and inside were barrels, large, unmarked, filled with something I didn't recognize at first. Gasoline. My stomach dropped. The smell was thick in the air. He was fumbling with a hose, clearly planning to dump it all into the lake. Poison it. Destroy it. If he couldn't control the lake, he'd rather ruin it for everyone. "Gerald!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the water. He spun, wild-eyed, sweat streaking down his face. "You don't get it, do you?" he screamed. "This lake isn't yours. It never was. It belongs to the community, my community. And if I can't have it, then nobody will." I took a cautious step forward, trying to steady my voice. "Think about what you're doing. You'll go to prison for this. You'll destroy the homes, the wildlife, everything." He laughed, an unhinged, hollow sound. "I already lost everything. What's left to take from me?" He yanked the hose, tipping one of the barrels. Gasoline splashed onto the ground, the fumes sharp and suffocating. My heart pounded. I dialed 911 with one hand while shining the flashlight on him with the other, keeping my distance. The dispatcher stayed calm, but I could hear the urgency in her voice as she promised deputies were on the way. I just had to stall him. I kept talking, reminding him of what little dignity he had left, of the neighbors who once looked up to him, of the children whose homes surrounded the lake. For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through. His hands trembled, his eyes darted as if he could see the consequences flashing before him. But then he snarled, grabbed a lighter from his pocket, and flicked it to life. My blood went cold. One spark, and it would all go up. The dock, the water, maybe even the houses nearby if the fire spread. I knew I couldn't wait for the deputies. So I did the only thing I could, I lunged. The flashlight clattered to the ground as I tackled him, knocking the lighter from his hand. We struggled on the dock, his fists flailing wildly, his breath reeking of alcohol and gasoline fumes. He was strong with rage, but I had something he didn't, resolve. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone who had trusted me with this lake. With a final shove, I pinned him down, my knee in his chest as he thrashed. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until the blue and red lights painted the water. Deputies swarmed in, pulling him off me, cuffing him once again. This time, he didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just sagged, broken, muttering to himself as they led him away. The barrels were confiscated, the truck towed, the lighter bagged as evidence. Gerald was done. For good. The court didn't go easy on him. Between the vandalism, the trespassing, and now attempted environmental terrorism, the charges stacked high. His bail was revoked, and he was sentenced to years in prison. The HOA, already gasping for breath, finally dissolved in his absence. No one wanted to resurrect it. No one wanted to live under that shadow again. The bylaws, the fines, the endless threats, they were relics now, tossed aside like the rubble of a failed empire. As for the lake, it healed. Without Gerald's poison, without his rules, it became what it was always meant to be, a place of peace, of joy, of community. The Marina thrived, not as a business, but as a gathering place. Families launched boats, kids learned to fish, neighbors shared meals by the water. It wasn't about ownership anymore, it was about freedom. Sometimes, when I sit on the dock at sunset, I think about Gerald. I think about the man he could have been if he hadn't been consumed by control. Power had been his poison long before gasoline ever touched the ground. And in the end, it destroyed him. But his downfall became our salvation. I never wanted to own the Marina. I never wanted to fight the HOA. All I wanted was to launch my boat on my own lake in peace. But when they pushed, I pushed back harder. And in the end, I didn't just win a battle, I freed an entire community from the grip of tyranny. The lake is quiet now. The water glitters under the moonlight, carrying the laughter of children and the hum of boats drifting lazily along the surface. It belongs to no one and everyone, all at once. And every time I push my boat off the dock, feeling the gentle sway of the water beneath me, I know the truth. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from courts or councils or bylaws. Sometimes, justice comes from one man standing his ground, no matter the cost. And as the bow of my boat cuts through the calm water, I smile to myself. Justice, after all, is best served on the waves of freedom.